Hello there, I'm Dr. Zach Weir. Welcome to this historical and philosophical analysis of the Common Schools movement in the 19th century. Today we will examine the deep tensions embedded within this reform, specifically balancing its democratic goal of social cohesion against the stark historical realities of forced cultural assimilation. This analysis is structured around 6 core areas. First, we'll look at the structural transformation into state systems, the visionary ideals of Horace Mann, and the standardization of morals via the McGuffey readers. Then I will address the critical assimilation and marginalization errors, before concluding with the synthesis of philosophical and biblical worldview reflections. To set the context, we must understand the shift in the educational paradigm. This era was marked by a definitive departure from unstructured, localized, and community-driven instruction, moving towards an era of an institutionalized state-sponsored format. This macro-level transformation saw the rise of state-sponsored universal systems that were funded directly by taxpayers. Proponents argued that this massive structural expansion was essential to the development of an informed citizenry, capable of supporting the young republic. Consequently, education transitioned heavily towards administrative efficiency and standardized oversight. The primary champion of this movement was Horace Mann, the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. Known for declaring education as the great equalizer, he envisioned common schools as a vital balance wheel of the social machinery. He believed universal access could cultivate shared civic virtues and common public ideals across all social classes. He famously challenged us, "Be ashamed to die until you have won some victory for humanity." To weave this diverse population into a unified national identity, common schools implemented standardized curriculum, exemplified by the McGuffey readers. Rather than neutral tools for literacy, these readers were vehicles to promote a specific Protestant Anglo-American moral code, thus molding the characters of young citizens to emphasize industry, punctuality, and civic responsibility. However, when evaluating this movement, we must look beyond its idealism and analyze its friction with cultural pluralism. The drive for national cohesion ultimately created severe cultural impacts and systemic tensions for those outside the dominant culture. In practice, the push for social cohesion functioned as a one-sided imposition of dominant cultural values rather than an exclusive exchange. For example, immigrant children, particularly those of European Catholic background, face intense institutionalized pressure to abandon their native language and traditions. Historically, the common school model served as a source of social control, suppressing diversity to prevent perceived social fragmentation. The most aggressive implementation of this assimilation philosophy occurred through the forced boarding school model. Policymakers deliberately utilized education to systematically eliminate indigenous heritage. Native American children were separated from their communities and placed into boarding schools designed for total cultural erasure, replacing tribal identity with Western frameworks and a forced demand for social conformity. Simultaneously, the movement claim of universality stood in stark contradiction to racial exclusion. African Americans were systematically denied access to white common schools and faced intense structural and legal funding barriers. In response, black communities demonstrated profound resilience by utilizing mutual aid societies and independent churches to establish and sustain their own independent school system. A philosophical reflection is that history yields a vital philosophical reflection. Educational structures are never completely neutral. Historical evidence demonstrates that education frequently functions as an instrument of prevailing cultural and political interests, asserting specific epistemological frameworks as the only legitimate route to civic participation and reinforcing dominant power dynamics. As Christian educators, we must critically evaluate this legacy through a biblical worldview. Scripture reveals that diversity among tribes, peoples, and languages is intentional and integral to creation as beautifully depicted in Revelation 7:9. Because every individual is image bearer of God, educational practices that enforce absolute cultural uniformity fundamentally diminishes human dignity. True education must affirm dignity, not suppress the culture. In conclusion, the history of the Common Schools movement challenges us to build educational spaces that balance civic responsibilities with profound respect for individual image bearers. This analysis relies upon historical frameworks from Smith's textbook and the theological foundations from the English Standard Version of the Bible. Thank you again for your time.